right, welcome everybody to Satsang, May 14th, 2026. And tonight we're going to talk about surrender and acceptance. One of the things you may want to notice, by the way, tonight, I'd be correct. I pulled a piece from Consciousness Speaks, which is one of Ramesh Balsekar's really nice pieces. And and what I enjoy about this, and you may as well, is that the Nisargadatta has a certain style, and it's a wonderful style, as you all know. And then Ramesh came along, and his style is a much different style of teaching and delivering, and it's actually every now and then a really nice experience to delve into that particular approach. It he obviously both of them are saying the same thing, and Ramesh sat at the feet of Nisargadatta for the 3 years and then became the next one in, as it were. But it's always really interesting. So just notice that tonight as we go through this. I put an excerpt up. It's on acceptance and surrender. It's in a book called Consciousness Speaks by Ramesh. Uh,
What page?
um, I
What
don't
chapter?
I don't really know. Just look up acceptance and surrender. There's a little section that says that, and that's where I'm reading. That's
Okay.
where I'm reading from. Yeah. Sorry about that, Brad. I didn't. It's funny. A lot of the ones I have, they're PDFs.
Oh yeah.
So what happens is that the number on the page and the number, the way that the PDF is, and then the number on the page, those don't match. And then I noticed that these don't have any numbers on the page.
Acceptance.
So I've got my version of the PDF is doesn't have any numbers. So anyway, but if you look up acceptance and surrender, you'll come right to it.
Okay.
Yeah. So here we go. Acceptance and surrender. He says regarding the word individual, he says the very root of the word means undivided. How's that for an interesting thing? He says, correct. You see, what is indivisible is consciousness. All right. So somewhere way back in the way back, when individuals were named, actually someone knew that it was simply an extrusion. It was a boundary line, but that it was indivisible. Um, he says, and in the understanding of that, the individual, as we understand the word, gets demolished, gets annihilated. He says, because we see it with the ego and so on. That's the way we interpret life, as a person, as a life, as a person with a life, as a living entity. He says, from the point of view of a yana, there is no one who has any volition or choice in anything in this phenomenal world. It's acceptance. From the point of view of devotion, the word would be surrender, but basically it means acceptance that there is no such thing as an individual entity with the independence of choice and action. Thy will be done, then the mind becomes quiet. It's so simple, but it's so difficult. Famous last words, right? Now notice, and in the piece I wrote this week, I talk a lot about that because what happens is that when we start to talk about acceptance and surrender, we immediately locate on the ego itself or me. So what is doing the acceptance and surrender? What we see is that if I can create acceptance and surrender at the ego level, right, that now the ego will float along with whatever else is. So that's the normal approach, right? That's the normal way that folks approach it. But the ultimately, the acceptance and surrender is simply seeing, right, that we are part of the whole. And so that this whole thing about accentuating the ego, accentuating the I, is what's getting in our way, right? It's not working with the I, but rather seeing what the I is, seeing what the ego is. That's where the action is. And in a real important way, it makes it way easier, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. He says, the organization of a physical organism is far more complex than that of any political or commercial corporation. And yet it works with a minimum of conscious control, right? The circuits of the brain and nerves are more subtle than any computer system, and yet we hardly know how to use them because it's being done for us, is what he's saying. When history began, we put on clothes, picked up tools, and learned how to speak and think. In the words of a writer called Lancelot White, thought is born of failure. This is really a neat piece. When action satisfies, there is no residue to hold the attention. So when the action goes the way you want it, gone, right? He says to think is to confess a lack of adjustment, which we must stop and consider. Only when the human organism fails to achieve the adequate response to its situation is there material for processes of thought. Now that's one that's probably one of the deeper explorations that I've ever seen, which is that thought itself functionally is a result of something not occurring the way that we wanted it to occur. Right? So that's his access point for the generation of thought itself, right? He says, when one thinks that he is not happy, only when one thinks that what is not acceptable does the thought arise, what should I do to make the what is more acceptable? Then the whole train of misery begins. To be anxious is to wear oneself out, and to seek power and to use force to overstrain one's system. One is best preserved by floating along without stress, which is the same as Jesus' doctrine of not being anxious for the morrow and of earning one's bread by the sweat of one's brow. Now, notice what he's saying, getting into the management of me is much more energetically draining than simply watching what happens to that same me. He says the theme runs throughout the spiritual literature. You will get it if you do not want it, and to him that hath shall be given. To those who feel they have not, this is an exasperating paradox. If deep inside you want most desperately to survive and be in control of things, right? Remember, survival lends its energy to control. Always remember that. So the survival is this honest and authentic thing that the body mind does, right? Control is the extension of that energy in an attempt to control what's outside, right? Okay. He says if deep inside you cannot genuinely take the attitude of not worrying about it. If deep inside what you want most desperately is to survive and be in control of things. And trying to stop worrying means making an effort to control. You must allow yourself the freedom to worry, to let the mind think whatever it wants to think. So we come back to the old formula of witnessing. Now, what I was pointing out earlier about how Nisargadatta would get to witnessing and how he gets to witnessing. You see, this is a much more Buddhist style concept, which is suffering arises from wanting to be things different than they are. Right. So he's coming in it from that side. Nisargadatta usually goes into the I know I exist, go find the knowing, right? The I am. Same, the witnessing, we come back to that formula. You cannot deliberately stop worrying. If you try to stop worrying, you become more involved in it. So what is the answer? It is simple. When worry comes up, let it come up. As worry comes up, if it is witnessed, you are not taken deep into further involvement. Because we believe that worry causes tension, we feel that we must not worry. Right? So there's this, wow, if I'm worrying, I'm creating tension. But then we basically put that on steroids by trying to control the worry. Right? He says, but you cannot not worry. The only way the worry will stop is through the proper understanding that change is the very basis of life. We cannot continuously have something we like. You've got to be prepared to accept things in life which may not be acceptable. That is the only understanding which will ultimately reduce and perhaps remove worry. But you cannot deliberately stop worrying. Right? Trying to control the mind or trying to control the senses means there is an individual wanting control for his own reasons. There is still the individual wanting something and therefore acting with a certain purpose. So the questioner says, so with enlightenment, all desire ceases. Nope. It is not that desires do not arise. Desires arise, the senses are drawn towards their objects, but there is no involvement by a me. On the spiritual path, a person is told, if you are to unite with Shiva, you must control yourself. You must control the senses. So he's trying to control the senses and becomes neurotic. When the understanding at least begins that it is accepted, senses get attracted to the objects, so there's no hindrance. The senses and their objects getting together are merely witnessed. Right? So notice what happens. I mean, this is the transformation that happens in like every great religion, so to speak, right? You can go to that religion and you can almost always find the egoicized version, right? You're going to find who's in charge, how it's in charge, and then the teaching is all about how to control the individual such that that individual now becomes more saintly or more godly or however that particular religion sees it. But what's happened is that when you create a living understanding, you create a place where there's an understanding of not I, right? And that's what escapes most people when they first start working with the sense of non-duality, is that they have nowhere for this understanding. There's just nowhere for that to be. So it doesn't make any sense. So the listening in that way, right? Christianity, that's the one I'm most familiar with. You can tell that those listening to whatever it was that the teaching was lowered it down one level and egoicized it, and that became Christianity. So understand that most of the teaching that we spent a whole life, right? For those of us who grew up in the United States, Christianity more or less is in your mother's milk. That's an Osho quote, by the way. And so whether you like it or whether you don't, you likely have imbibed conditioning that is Christian in nature, and you likely don't even see it anymore, right? So when you're looking at acceptance, this want to go look only at the ego and not at the entirety of everything that arises, well, it's well understood. It's the way that somebody who has lived a Christian style is likely to go look at it, right? Because we're always looking at the individual, at the ego, right? All right. A sincere seeker. Now there's some fun examples, and you see the uproar in this world about um, gurus and personages who go astray because they do things that most people think they shouldn't do. Right? Usually has to do with sex and, well, in Osho's case, is Rolls Royces, but whatever. It's all of that, right? So sincere seeker asked Ramana Maharshi, I'm carried away by the sight of the breasts of a young woman neighbor. I fear I will commit adultery. What should I do? All right. Ramana replied, it is your senses and body which tempt you and which you confuse with your real self. First know who is tempted and who is there to tempt. But even if adultery does take place, do not think about it afterwards, because you are yourself always pure. You are not the sinner. Right? Now that you got to be careful with this one, and we'll talk about that in a second. What this means is that it is not the act which is the sin. You're thinking about it and you're attaching the sin to yourself is the trouble. So sinning is really not in the act itself, but in assuming the guilt. Remember, this was addressed to a seeker who was deeply concerned about his committing a sin. It does not apply. Here's the part where you can get in trouble. It does not apply to the person who is not a seeker, who if he were to commit a sin, would then say, look, Ramana Maharshi says I'm not the sinner, anything goes. Right. So that's the slippery slope of this comment. So when you hear this teaching, there's a responsibility that goes with the teaching, which is to the teaching is a wonderful teaching, but applies to the witnessing, the who you are as a witness, right? It's not a freebie. I remember, Ramesh would take great care in trying to talk about assembling what you think you're most responsible for, and then you would find all of the reasons that had to happen that you had nothing to do with. And upon that examination, it was very difficult to come out thinking that one was responsible for whatever, even the act that you thought you might be most responsible for. And inevitably, there would be somebody in the back of the room who would raise their hand and he'd say, "What?" And he says, "Well, this means I can go get a gun and go out there and kill anybody I'd like." Right. And this is the ego approach, right? He just got through explaining and teaching to you that you have no control over what you do. And the first thing that someone says is, "Hey, I can go out and I can," right? A whole explanation of if I'm in control, what I can do based on what it is you're teaching me. So just watch for that, slipperiness, right? He says, can a yoni commit adultery? Of course not. It would not be a yoni committing adultery. An act takes place and will have its consequences. If adultery does take place, then the point, which is not relevant here, is that the act of adultery could lead to certain consequences, which that organism will have to bear. Because the action which has happened through a particular organism, understanding will prevent him from taking personal guilt for it, and he will also be ready for the body, mind, organism to accept the consequences such as they are. Right? Now, Nisargadatta had a quick temper, and he would, and he would say this occasionally. He would say, "Well, I have a quick temper. I know that's not me, but I also know that what comes after is what comes after. Right? Whatever that quick temper generates, right, is what the body, mind, or the organism is now going to undergo, whatever that is." They tell about a saint named Camille who lived in a hut. A neighbor girl became pregnant by her lover. When she was pressed, she said, "Camille is the father." So when the child was born, the girl's parents brought the child to Camille and said, "It's your child, so you bring him up." And he said, "So be it." And he brought up the child. Later on, the girl repented. The girl and her parents came back and said, "Look, we're very sorry we made the mistake. The child is ours. Please let us have him back." And he said, "So be it." Right? An act will have consequences, but the consequences may not relate to the person to whom the act has happened. Right? For example, a man driving a car throws a lighted cigarette out the window. A forest fire starts with disastrous consequences, but this man's 200 miles away. So the consequences of that act may not involve him at all. They may involve a lot of other, what we call innocent people. All of this is the functioning of totality. The point here is that assuming personal guilt means assuming personal doership. And in spontaneous virtuous living, the question of guilt or credit simply doesn't arise. All of it is merely witnessed. The fact of the matter is the human being as such cannot exist as an independent entity. He's only an infinitesimal part of the totality of manifestation. Now, I remember when I was young, I was a missionary in Peru, so I can remember often it was a time where you would be out in the middle of nowhere a lot walking, and so you could consider lots of things that drove you crazy. And one of the things that drove me crazy was this whole concept of how humans try to find who's responsible for everything, and then they try to basically assign the punishment. And yet it was always really obvious to me that a large part of the time that the activity and the punishment didn't match, right? They just didn't. And even though we would convene a bunch of folks and say, "You decide if this person's guilty or innocent," it was obvious to me that there was a high likelihood that whatever it was that they were saying wasn't the case and didn't apply. And that one and it drove me crazy to think that there was an entire body of effort through thousands of years to try to make this thing work. And it didn't work. Now, I never ever had an answer to that other than this is one of those that drive me crazy. And there are a couple others as well, but that was one I'd walk about. At 20 years old, I'm walking around thinking about that one, right? So the first time I heard Ramesh explain this, I was like, there it is, right there. There you go. That's actually what's going on, right? The how he describes it takes it takes into consideration the fact that a lot of times an activity happens and the results of that activity have nothing to do with who create the body mind that created it. Real common. All right. So, so basically all of this is the functioning totality. The point here is that assuming personal guilt means assuming personal doership. And in spontaneous virtuous living, the question of credit or guilt just simply doesn't arise. I already said that. All of it is merely witnessed. The fact of the matter is the human being as such cannot exist as an independent entity. He's only an infinitesimal part of totality of manifestation. So you start to see acceptance is not the acceptance of the ego. It's simply the seeing that this is how it arises. Right. Now, you remember sometimes I talk about the Tibetan exercise where you take your perception and you look out, right? And then you close your eyes and you continue with that perception as you close your eyes. And in your closed eye space, you move back one step and you include yourself in the perception, right? And then you open your eyes once that perception style is absorbed, you open your eyes and now you're perceiving through your eyes, but also the perceiving from behind you is happening as well, so to speak. So this is what he's talking about, right? That the witnessing includes you. And when the witnessing includes you, it creates an entirely different version of acceptance and surrender. Because it's no longer you doing something, it's you seeing that something is the case. And in what we do, that's always the case, right? It's always witnessing, watching, who are you really? It's always about seeing what is the case. That's what we spend our time doing. Okay. He says, what a man desperately wants is security for the future. He cannot be happy even when he has everything his heart desires. He has a future to look forward to, and his experience of the past tells him that change is the very essence of life, and that security has never had anything resembling permanency. The result is, even against his better judgment, he cannot help chasing the will of the wisp, which he has named security. The real tragedy of this situation is he's afraid to enjoy himself. There is a fear of being happy because he knows he cannot hang on to it. But when there's a true understanding, there is an unqualified, joyous acceptance of the fact that life and living is not a stagnant pool, but a running water which you cannot store in a bucket. When there's an understanding of the present moment as a marvelous eternal moment unrelated to time, then there's an uninhibited enjoyment of what the present moment has provided. All right. So there you go. All right. So here we're going to go. I'm dropping down a little bit. It says, when one begins to feel a growing sense of disidentification, is that like a sense of defeat? Now, you remember last time I talked about getting angry, right? So if anger is part of your makeup, then there's an insane power in that connection, right? What happens in witnessing is that even when anger is expressed, it just doesn't contain that fullness that it had before. It just doesn't. Identification seems to contain this incredible fullness and ownership of what it is that's being projected. And so that's what he's talking about. He says, not defeat. So disidentification as witnessing happens, right? There's going to be a sense of that disidentification that's going to begin to locate itself in your world. And then that becomes a permanent feature of the world. So he says, not defeat. He says there's a sense of acceptance and a sense of tremendous freedom. Can you imagine? You think you have all this burden and all this responsibility. Then you begin to understand that the same actions will continue to happen based on reactions of this body, mind, organism. The same actions will continue. Whatever you may do to fight what is supposed to happen, they're still going to happen. When you understand this deeply, you have a sense of tremendous freedom. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. Why should I worry? All I can do is whatever I have been doing. You continue to act with a sense of responsibility, with a sense of compassion, if that is your nature, but knowing that you have no control over the consequences of your actions. The basic point is to understand and accept that whatever you do, the consequences are not in your hands. Right? He says, what about talking with this stuff all the time, like with friends, talking about how you view yourself and how you want to have? Is that just perpetuating? Ramesh, it is just conceptualizing. So it really doesn't serve any purpose. Now, it's really a waste of time. Understanding that will make you naturally talk a little less. Not sure that was true with me, but I think that is more or less the case. He said, sir, the other day I was talking about how all my life I felt bad about what I thought I was missing, that I wasn't brave on a roller coaster and all that. It's occurred to me that if my role in life is to be a sissy, just as Arjuna was supposed to be a warrior, and Ramesh says that's correct. So theoretically, I shouldn't feel bad about not being brave. He said, not theoretically, anything but theoretically. He says, there has to be such an intuitive conviction that it's all right to be a sissy, that it's all right to be what you are. Sissy is a label by the split mind. I'm always wanting to be something other than what I am. Ramesh, that's precisely the point, you see. Right? So that's it, right? That's the whole thing. So anyway, so Ramesh sets us up now for where we're going to wander into, what we're going to wander into next. And so, but I want you to see that as he talks about acceptance and surrender, did you notice he didn't spend any time talking about controlling the you? None of that, right? Which is what we've heard for the entirety of our life. So remember that. That's what's going on, witnessing. So when you worry about it, witness the worry, right? Because the compounding also takes I do something wrong. Now I worry about something wrong, and now I worry about worrying about something wrong. You see what happens? So now you started out by simply doing something quote unquote wrong, right? And that's now extended. You have a 3-tier version of how it is that you need to, drive this vehicle. So simply watch it all, right? And what you'll probably find is a credible respect developing, because your mind is amazing. It does some stuff. It really does. And watching it is, it's amazing to me. I watched in today's world, they have clips of everything out there, right? People doing the most idiotic stuff. And it's none of it's free, right? And I think to myself, why go to all the trouble of posting it, making a video and all that kind of nonsense when you just simply watch yourself? Because my guess is that if your personality is anything like the one that goes to this body mind, there's a lot going on. Deception, plots, plot lines, thinking, man, there's stuff going on. It's really good. Entertainment for free. Just watch. It's really cool.
You know what's gotten me for years? In the midst of, witnessing and not witnessing, whenever it arises or falls away, the ever returning question of what's the purpose of all this?
Yeah.
To what purpose is being served by all this stuff happening, whether you're identified or not? I mean, it seems random and chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's really difficult to accept that meaning is painted on, right? And it's painted on for the benefit of the ego feeling like it's important. That's the whole reason for all of that painting on, as it were.
Yeah.
So meaning ends up being this really divisive thing that your conditioning assembles around, right? I remember when I first got into philosophy, like the whole thing about man and meaning. I mean, that's a big discussion in the world of philosophy, right? That's like, and then you start to see this, and you're like going, oh,
Why?
oh wow,
Why?
yeah, yeah.
What's my
So.
purpose?
So I like the kinds of things, what is, why is there duality? It's simply consciousness creating the ability to watch itself, right? To give itself a show. When you listen to when you listen to all of the spiritual definite, or most of them that are like that, you have to kind of laugh when you see through them, because those are just sentences created to say it is what it is, right? What is the purpose of manifestation? Well, I can say it's consciousness creating so that it can watch itself, or I can say, don't know. In fact, I think it probably has no meaning, right? Because it's the same thing. You just made up something that says it's being projected so it
Oh
can be
yeah.
watched. Well,
Yeah.
that's kind of a silly explanation, but those are the explanations that we utilize. And in a certain way, what they do is they allow us to move from the holdings of meaning to holdings that look like meaning, and then laugh about them when we see through them, right? 'Cause that is the dissolution of meaning, is to say there isn't any. Right?
I kind of think sometimes like the body mind is a robot, and then that we're robots with opinions.
Well, yeah, that's for sure. Plethora of those, yeah.
Yeah, man. Sorry.
Right. So here we go. Brad's got a poem for us later, and I'm gonna let him roll into that after I'm done with this piece of mine.
It's
So
short. It's short.
I knew that. I know that. I've read it several times. All right, here we go. So here we go. Acceptance and surrender are among the most misunderstood words in the spiritual conversation. They sound passive, resigned, almost weak. The mind hears surrender and imagines defeat. It hears acceptance and imagines toleration, gritting one's teeth while secretly hoping reality will improve itself into something more manageable. But neither acceptance nor surrender has anything to do with passivity, nor are they practices in the conventional sense. They're not things someone does. In fact, the whole difficulty begins precisely because we assume there is someone there who must perform them. Huh? So it was January in Pune, crisp, clean, the kind of morning where freshness sat in the air like an extra guest. 4 or 5 of us were standing in the corner of the garden talking about meditation. I was still green at this whole seeking business. Uh, I'd thrown myself into India the same way I'd thrown myself into everything else in life, head down, full speed, the next mountain waiting to be climbed. But that morning, the mountain was not cooperating. The freshness of the moment was obvious, undeniable, even though it seemed it belonged to somebody else. I was trapped in the machinery of the mind, while life itself stood outside the bars. One of the group pointed up after a long silence. The wings of a bird in flight leave no tracks, yet they know the way. Something unusual happened. The mind failed to catch the sentence. Normally, it would have seized the words, filed them away, started comparing them to every other spiritual thing I had ever heard, but this time it missed. What landed was not the phrase, but the absence inside it, the emptiness where the track should have been. The bird moved through the sky untouched. The sky remained untouched. There was only movement. That moment split something open. I suddenly saw how much of my life had been spent filling in imaginary lines. Every line, every role, every expectation, every argument, every quarterly close, every identity. The lines themselves had never existed. They had been assumed into existence. And we were taught to outline reality, to divide it, to categorize it, to defend it. But in that garden, it became obvious manifestation does not have any of those divisions. There was no surrender in the moment, no acceptance either. Those words came later, but the wordless language beneath them had just appeared. It may help to understand how we wind up missing something so obvious. The average human being looks out into manifestation and sees something not unfolding according to preference. It it immediately the reflex appears, fix it, change it, improve it, resist it. The assumption underneath this reflex is ancient and almost invisible. I am the doer. I am responsible for controlling the moment. Sooner or later, the intuition begins whispering that something is wrong with this arrangement. The seeking movement begins. Usually, the first thing located is the ego, and we say, "Ah, the ego is a problem," and this becomes the new project. Right? This was certainly true for me. The entire reason I was standing in that garden in Pune was because I'd heard Osho speak about the ego and knew immediately that he's pointing towards something real. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to India. But there's a subtle trap here. By focusing exclusively on the ego, we miss the larger revelation entirely. We arrive believing there is a little independent self inside here and a world outside there. Ego versus manifestation, me versus life. Then we discover the ego is illusory and we think the work is done. But the deeper seeing is far more radical. The whole field is trackless, not just the ego, everything. The body, mind, thoughts, emotions, circumstances, relationships, manifestation itself. None of it carries the boundary lines we insist on drawing. Right? And in fact, we approach it thinking the boundary lines are there, and all we're doing is drawing in the boundary lines to basically confirm that they are there because we approach it thinking they are. Right? The bird left no tracks because there were never any tracks available to leave. We were the ones imagining them. Ego did not precede the boundary lines. Ego existed because of the boundary lines. The outlines themselves created the apparent entity. The moment manifestation was divided into this and that, subject and object appeared simultaneously. But causality reveals something very different. Arising always comes first, definition comes later. Experience appears before conceptualization, overlays itself upon it. There is no pre-existing outline waiting for us to discover it. There is only the seamless movement of what is. This is where acceptance and surrender begin to take on an entirely different meaning. Ramesh Balsekar sorted out these two beautifully from the standpoint of knowledge, jnana. This understanding is called acceptance. From the standpoint of devotion, bhakti, it's called surrender. Different rooms, same furniture. Both point towards the same recognition. There is no separate individual entity possessing individual choice and action. Everything arises within the total functioning of totality itself. Thy will be done is not a request directed towards the future. It is the noticing of what already is the case. You see that? Thy will be done is simply a noticing of what already is the case. That's the deeper. But the average seeker immediately converts acceptance into another project for the ego. Okay, the mind says, I must become more accepting. And now the doer is simply put on spiritual clothing. The ego attempts acceptance in order to improve its relationship with manifestation. It wants smoother onboarding, better emotional weather, more manageable suffering. Yeah. Ramesh never tired of pointing out that this does not work. It is not an achievement. It is the understanding that everything is already arising by itself and that nothing stands outside this happening to direct it. All is included, even resistance, even confusion, even non-acceptance. That's why Ramesh would often emphasize that understanding does not remove functioning. The body mind continues exactly as it has before. Thoughts arise, reactions arise, preferences arise. The difference is that the sense of ownership gradually weakens. Right? Remember I was talking about anger? That's a great way to put it. Right? When anger is owned, it has much more fullness. As anger is seen as not owned, it loses that. So does everything that moves out of the individual. Right? Lancelot White, who Ramesh quoted frequently, said something extraordinary, insightful. Thought is born of failure. When action satisfied, no residue remains. Attention moves naturally with life itself. Thought begins only when the mind decides the present moment is unacceptable and begins strategizing ways to rearrange it into something preferable. That single moment launches the entire train of suffering. What should I do? How do I fix this? How do I stop worrying? How do I surrender better? There you go. The conductor boards the train precisely at the moment the present moment is rejected. Right? The train has no conductor, right? The gripping of the wheel, the turning of the wheel is not connected to anything that's happening on the train, right? So now the conductor arrives and pretends that he's steering the train, when in fact that's not the case. Years later, I was sitting in Ramesh's front room in Mumbai for Satsang. The city noise was always present there, horns, scooter, voices, the endless pulse of Mumbai pressing through the windows. That day, the first person to speak was a taxi driver who had spent 45 years driving in Mumbai traffic. For 10 solid minutes, he described his misery. He hated being a taxi driver. He hated Mumbai traffic. He hated his life. And more importantly, he had spent decades nesting in this dissatisfaction as though it were his permanent residence. Ramesh listened patiently for an almost unbearable stretch of time. Then finally he said, "It seems to me that after driving a taxi in Mumbai for 45 years, you would see that you were a taxi driver in Mumbai." That was all. No techniques, no philosophy, no spiritual acrobatics. The obvious had simply been stated so directly that the conceptual structure momentarily collapsed. A taxi driver in Mumbai, 45 years. Reality itself had never been the problem. The suffering existed in the argument with reality. This should not be happening. This should be different. This is not my life. The mind continually rejected what already was. Acceptance and surrender were not actions performed upon the moment. They were the ending of an argument with the moment. The bird had never left the skies. Ramesh quoted the old phrase, "This too shall pass." He first heard it as a film and as a teenager, and it stayed with him the rest of his life. When circumstances were too painful, this too shall pass. When circumstances are wonderful, this too shall pass. Nothing to cling to, nothing to flee, just the seamless moment of manifestation arising and dissolving. The human being seeks permanence in a resonance universe whose very nature is change. Normally, frustration follows. We seek security where there is no security, where no security can even exist. We seek permanence in movement. We seek control over an appearing that was never personal to begin with. And yet something extraordinary begins to happen when this understanding deepens. Not intellectually, existentially, the burden lightens. Responsibility in the psychological sense begins to dissolve. Actions still occur, decisions still appear, life continues exactly as before, but the crushing sense of I am personally responsible for controlling the universe begins to fade. What tremendous freedom there is in that. Not irresponsibility, freedom. You continue to act according to your nature. Compassion if compassion arises. Firmness as firmness arises. Silence as silence arises. But increasingly, there is a recognition that consequences were never in your hands. Right? I was a corporate guy. Guess what arose a lot in my life? Corporate stuff. Yeah. I tried really hard not to do that. But you know what? Mumbai taxi driver, 45 years. Same thing, right? So that became the thing in my life that delivered the existential sense of acceptance and surrender. It was just seeing that that was what was wanting to happen. And when that was seen, then there was a release into what wanted to happen. That simple thing is worth whatever it is that you and your personality is designed to do. Right? He says, you continue to act according to your nature. said that. This is true surrender, not giving up possessions, not renouncing life, only the surrender of personal doership, the surrender of the imaginary manager. And strangely enough, this surrender does not produce passivity, it produces intimacy with life itself because resistance consumes enormous energy. Once the argument relaxes, life becomes extraordinarily immediate, simple. Things return freshness, humor, ordinary moments, the sound of traffic, the movement of birds through an empty sky, nothing special. And because nothing special is demanded, everything quietly becomes enough. That's why Ramesh would laugh and while saying, it is so simple, and then immediately add, and it's so difficult. Because simplicity threatens the entire structure of personal identity. The seeker wants methods, milestones, guarantees. Instead, he is handed the obvious. The moment is already what is. Life is already unfolding. The bird is already flying. The wings leave no tracks. And somehow, without a map, without a manager, without an individual orchestrating existence, they still know the way. Right? And that's the end of that piece, right? So as you begin to work with that, you will notice that the ego will over time align with that, right? We always talk about annihilating the ego, and that's a really touchy one because awakened there is still an ego, right? If I go, hey Ramesh, he's going to say what? That's ego functioning, right? The ego functions basically to operate within apparent separation. So when two body minds want to speak to each other, even though we know that's consciousness speaking to consciousness, right? There is an operational piece that's in there that actually functions in order for that to happen. And we label that or identify that as the ego. And then there are two kinds of ego. Ramesh used to call it the thinking mind and the working mind. The working mind is the operating piece that simply sees that what is happening is what's happening, and the mind is allowed to do what it is relative to that. The thinking mind is the one that contains all of the pieces that are basically resisting what is. That's the thinking mind. Strategy, ego, what about me? How do I get what I want? All of that. That's the thinking mind. Right. So those are the two pieces that are in play. One shifts to the other. Most every seeker comes into the world very thinking mind oriented. How do I do this? How do I nail this down? I'm going to wrestle this spirituality thing to the ground just like I have everything else. Huh? Yeah, I'm going to bulldoze it. Frontal assault. That's how I've done everything else. That's how I'm going to do this one. Right. And then it's seen, right, that there isn't an ego. In that way, the resistance part of the ego is not operational. It serves nothing. A lot of noise. There's what's that very famous Shakespeare quote? You
Oh
know,
yeah, the
the noise and
life is a basically an idiot about an idiot. How's that go?
well, the one I'm talking about is the noise and all of that signifying nothing is what he says at the end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So that's
Sound and fury.
yeah. Full
thank
of
you.
exact. There you go. There's
Thank you. That's the quote. And
yeah. There it is.
I
Thank
usually
you.
remember that one. But I always love that quote, the sound and fury.
Tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. There it is.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So that's the thing. That's the thinking mind, right? We get a lot of stuff out. I mean, look at all the shorts on YouTube you can watch, right? A lot of that. Get a lot of that. That's, as I say, the entertainment. They package the entertainment and deliver it to us when we actually have it all right here. So Sonia, that's what I have for tonight. Any comments? I know Brad wants to do a piece of poetry. Jump in when you want to do that, Brad.
I just want to add, I just want to say something that's
Yeah.
not related to this, but because it's something that kind of floats through my mind with some regularity, and that is that yeah, the body mind is taking the actions that it's directed to do, okay, and yet there's all these thought patterns that say, oh, I need to balance my checkbook. Oh, I need to, I mean, just purely functional activities, you know. I got to call Roy about that blah 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 or whatever it is, and And it's basically just an overlay about what's already in movement anyhow, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's pretty much what I thought, but
Yes.
it shows up and I go, God, I got a deadline to meet or whatever it
Well,
is, you know.
I mean, think about it for a second. I mean, what we know. I mean, Ramesh used to always talk about this. Night we could go find it. It's in the Advaita, the Buddha, and the Whole.
Okay.
And he talks about a study, and I think a lot of them have been done, but basically that um, when the mind does something it thinks it's responsible for, actually the arising of the activity has happened first. And then the what it is that is pointed to as the causer, the causal piece, right, is created after the action has arisen.
Oh, the commentary follows.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But it's so securely anchored that the belief is that it comes first. And I often compare that to, because it happens and we don't even notice it, right? It's seamless. We all assume that, we all live in a world where I intended to do this and this is what followed. That's the kind of box we live in, right? So think of the situation that when you look out with your eyes, right? Actually on your retina, the image comes in upside down, right? Now, have you ever seen an upside down image in your mind? Likely not. Why? Because the mind turns it over instantaneously in some nanosecond kind of thing, right? So the reality is that the perception is upside down, but it turns it right side up. Well, in that same way, instantaneously the mind places the story that happens after the arising before the arising, and it's never noticed.
Oh, that's a cool way to say that. Yeah.
It turns it right. One's upside down and one's before and after. So the before becomes the after, and the after becomes the before.
Alan, did you see that video about that bird, those birds I sent you the other day?
Yes. Yes.
So I just want to mention this because I thought it was so apropos to the wings leave no tracks. So there's this bird, it's called a godwit, and it flies from Alaska to New Zealand. It takes 7 days. It doesn't have webbed feet, so it can't land in the water. It doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep. So prior to them launching to New Zealand, the internal organs start to shrink, and the internal starts to fill up with fat for energy, and then the bird takes off, flies 11,000 kilometers in 7 days, and the brain shuts down half at one point so they can continue to fly and sleep at the same time. And I just thought that was such a cool, it just showed up in my YouTube feed, and I thought it was such a cool example of your thing. But anyway, I just wanted to share
Well,
that.
you know what the cool part of that is, Ron, if you think about it, is the fact that they fly while they're asleep.
Yeah,
So if you think about it, like you would never imagine that you would be functioning like that while you're asleep, right? And yet, so who's doing the flying? Let's
yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
And it was just ironic,
it's
because I really
amazing.
it just popped up, and I was like,
Yeah,
"Holy cow!" So I
yeah,
just wanted to share.
yeah.
Thank you.
It's funny that we have to scratch around and look for examples, because my sense of things is that there probably, had we not already assembled our life in a way where we said this is how it works and the rest of everything we're going to ignore, all of that stuff that would ignore, would be, we would have, and it's funny, now we go out looking for them, because it's just not in there. It doesn't apply. It doesn't construct what it is we've learned that we are. So there you go. So
Cool.
yeah. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you for today. That was awesome.
You're welcome. Enjoy it. Good. Good. All right, Brad, read your poem. Let's.
Yeah, it's a short one, but and when I read it I posted it back in 2017 on Facebook, and I hadn't seen it until the date came up that it was like exactly 8 years ago that I did this. And I went, God, I can't believe I wrote this. This I find it really amusing because I don't feel any ownership to these things. When I read something that I wrote a long time ago, I'm going, damn, that was pretty good. Who wrote that? It's like I'll just read it, but that's my basic feeling about it. Like I don't really own it. Okay, here goes. It goes. The startling truth is really not so surprising, not so difficult to understand. After all, so many things we've stubbornly believed, with nothing more than a thin thread of individualized identity to uphold the entire illusion, break into pieces when the underlying reality rises to be seen for what it is. And within this seeming riddle of what once was versus what now is, rides the tidal wave of authority that was always in control, while the little individual steered ferociously at the wheel, attached to nothing. I still find it amusing.
So that was a great one. Actually, it's a perfect coupling with what we talked about.
Yeah, that
But
was
then,
nice.
what's really interesting is and Ron and I have talked about this often, is the stuff that you write and you go back and you look at it and you go, wow, right?
Yeah.
And what we say is, oh my God, I didn't realize that I da 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 da, da, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that maybe a better version of that would be to say, wow, there's an obvious there's an obvious place where I was being lived into life, because Alan sure as hell didn't write that piece with that kind of depth and profound. And yet there it is,
Yeah.
right? There it is.
We're delivery boys.
It's one of the obvious places where if creativity shows up in writing for you, that you go back and read something you wrote 10 years ago and you're like, and you absorb it, but you know that 10 years ago that wasn't there. Like the absorbing that you do now, it wasn't there. It just, and you go, damn. So clearly, consciousness got it, used you to make sure that rolled out. That's there.
Yeah.
I'm gonna guess that Guion has that noticing quite a lot, because he deals in a world where, I'm sure you look at past writing and current writing and look at the past stuff and go, damn, that's good. And so that has to lead you to the who created it. I think that's just an obvious place to go.
Hey, I
Yeah.
just wanted to say how much I appreciate these weekly meetings and everybody that participates, and us hanging together on this call. It's a really nice thing to share with everybody. Just wanted to say that for what it's worth.
I
I'm
second
with
that
you, buddy.
emotion, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny because there had there's like, within doing things like this, it's out on Facebook and da da da. It lives kind of a little bit in that world. And so there's always this push, expand, da 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 da, and Michael and I were talking before we started today, and I always said Ramesh would have been jealous of this, because of what you can do in terms of the teaching, right? You can go to places. He would have a satsang every day, but it was rotating with lots and lots of new people. So that was what he dealt with. Whereas here we don't have that. So I was telling Michael, I said, yeah, there's this kind of natural instinct in the social media world to go out and do a little bit of advertising, get a few more folks in the room. I said, but I said, I steadfastly, refuse that. We have refused that, because this is such a free space for expression, that I think that in a satsang, where you're not really having to go back to the beginning and build it every time. It's really and it's funny, even Sachit came in this time, and and here he is right in the middle of it, no problem. He fits right into our little. It's really sweet that we all fit in so damn well.
And
So,
something I was pondering while you were talking as well, you know, a traditional satsang just doesn't seem it wants to work in the West right now. Like having you sit there and us just asking you questions and you answering just doesn't feel it doesn't fit into the pace of our life. And you doing it the way you're doing, bringing the text and reading it, and it just seems to be able to add so much more depth per the moment than a traditional satsang can actually deliver, because it just can't fit it all into an hour's worth of time. And what you fit into an hour really is significant each week. And I think that serves the purpose of the Western, the Western style of delivering this information.
No, it was funny. Michael was the one that, named it the Nisargadatta study group, and so we started off with that kind of a basis. I didn't know what it would turn into. But it actually ends up being, whether it's serendipitous or Michael had this capability of seeing the future, I'm not sure which, but the reality is that it works this way really, really nicely. And the delivery, this delivery works. It is not the normal, it's done in satsang style and feeling and holding, but it's done clearly with with an area that you want to work with and trying to find depth in that area for everybody that comes, which is different than the normal question and answer approach. So,
Precisely.
But I think it works really well. So
sometimes it feels like jazz improvisation to me.
It's got that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I know in my writing, you all read and then I'll jump in and say what there's both things are going on. It depends on what the moment pulls out. So. All right, guys. Well, that's it.
Thank you, all you guys, man. Thanks.
So we'll see you guys all next week. And then anything you want to say, Michael, as we leave? Are we good?
All good.
Okay, good enough. All right. Much love, everybody.
Thanks again, Alan.
Coming.
Yeah,
See you
bro.
next week.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Good.
Bye.